Hello and welcome everybody to today's lecture by Karen Mossberger, who is joining us virtually from Arizona State University. Karen is the Frank and June Sackton Professor in the School of Public Affairs in the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions at Arizona State University. She is also the director of the Center on Technology, Data, and Society and a senior sustainability scholar with the Julie N. Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Her research has covered interesting topics such as local governance, urban policy, digital inequality, the evaluation of broadband programs, and also digital government. Today's research is based on another large empirical and innovative study that looks at the interrelationship between digital connectivity, local entrepreneurship, and the resilience of community in times of distress. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome among us today virtually from Arizona State University, Karen Mossberger.
Before I start, I want to recognize my co-authors, Carolyn Tolbert from the University of Iowa, Scott Lacombe, who was a PhD student, in fact, at the University of Iowa, and now he's in his first tenure track position at Smith College in political science and also teaching data science. So it's the Iowa team that has really done the heavy lifting on the data and analysis that I'm going to share with you for the project with GoDaddy, the collaboration with GoDaddy on 20 million domain name websites. So I want to recognize them first. What I'm going to share with you, the main part of what I'm going to be sharing is basically an updated white paper that is not online yet, but will be there soon. And that's part of this collaborative project. Before I go into that though, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about a broader context, how this research with GoDaddy, which was a departure for us, it was something new, how this fits into a larger agenda on digital equity and on public policy. I want to talk a little bit about why we were interested in this data and why we were motivated to collaborate with the company on this project, and how this fits into some of these larger questions and I think it suggests some future research that could be done, not only by us, but by others, maybe by some of the people, maybe some of the PhD students here for their future research. So, COVID-19 very clearly demonstrated how essential the internet is today. And as Johannes mentioned, Carolyn and I worked on a book together a few years ago where we made the argument that internet use was digital citizenship, that it was fundamentally the ability to participate in society. It requires regular access and skills for effective use. And one way that we can measure this ability to participate in society is by the activities that people do online. This suggests something about capacity, about skills, but it also suggests expected benefits from that internet use based on what they're doing online. And some other colleagues, Hargitay, Helsper, Van Dersen, Van Dyke have written about this too, a second level digital divide, how activities matter for outcomes, for differentiated outcomes and so forth. So the pandemic though has also exposed, as Johannes mentioned, these persistent inequalities in internet access and use. And these are not only inequalities for individuals, but we can see spatial disparities, that there are these inequalities across communities, both for urban and for rural communities. We haven't been able to measure some of these spatial place-based disparities very well until recently. It's only at the end of 2018 that the census released the 2017 data for the the American Community Survey. That's the first time that we actually had data on broadband subscriptions, or a measure of broadband adoption and use across all census tracts in the US. And we can see from that data that we've analyzed for a book, we can see that there's zip codes in Memphis and as well as rural counties like Wheeler County, Georgia, where only about a quarter of the population has any kind of broadband subscription, and that includes mobile. So we're beginning to see at a more granular level these place-based disparities in adoption, but we know very little about specific uses of the internet at the community level. That just tells us about adoption and devices. So public policy, though, assumes that these different activities that people perform online have spillover benefits for communities beyond the individuals who engage in them. And really, that's why this is a public policy issue and not just an individual concern. There are assumptions about how this matters for economic development and education and civic engagement at the community level. But the research that we have has mostly tracked the impacts for broadband infrastructure or the availability of service in communities. That's because that's the data that was available. There is some research on internet use in firms, but we don't have much on internet use in the population. And this is important because mere availability doesn't mean that everyone in the community can afford broadband or has the skills to use it. And internet use has these network effects. The benefits from broadband in a community should increase with more widespread use, more inclusive use for a variety of purposes. So again, we need better data on use in communities in order to have evidence on the impacts of that use. It's also important, especially at this time, to examine this in the context of these larger place-based inequalities. There's been growth in economic and social inequality across communities before the pandemic, but of course this is probably being exacerbated by COVID-19. The impact of these disparities, we know from Raj Chetty and his colleagues, their work on the neighborhood level disparities and showing that where children grow up has a lifelong impact on earnings, on economic mobility. So there's some real consequences for these disparities. In the recovery from the past recession, there's been a lot written about the great reshuffling, the great divergence, but this is something that's longer term. There's been this longer term structural change that has meant that there's growing inequality across regions, between cities, across places since the 1980s. And technology has played a role in this. It's increased the returns to education, the significance of human capital. This technological change has created what Moretti has called the concentration of human capital in ecosystems of innovation. And there are regional patterns to this. There's been a lot written about superstar cities along the coast with a lagging heartland. Brookings and others have written about these regional disparities as well. So is this the whole story though? Can information technology actually support more inclusive growth in communities for recovery and for future economic opportunity? Are there some alternatives to just competing for the next Amazon headquarters? Not every community can become a tech hub. Are there strategies for local economic development that can be used in a diversity of communities, both urban and rural? Well, economists argue that human capital is really the driver of economic development in this century. Moretti has called this the human capital century. Technology use could be viewed as a form of human capital. It's usually measured as educational attainment, but technology use can be seen as a form of digital human capital too. It provides access to information. Others, Esther Hargitay has written about capital enhancing activities online. We know that digital skills are important for jobs. I'm going to be talking about entrepreneurship in a few minutes. Also, so there's more research on those first 2 points, but also there's a lot that's been written about the density in communities, in the density in large cities and metropolitan areas, and how that helps to foster the exchange of ideas and innovations through interactions in these networks. Is it possible that more inclusive broadband use leads to information networks that in communities, virtual networks that encourage more innovation and exchange of ideas too? So one measure of broadband use that we have used in some research is in a forthcoming book, Choosing the Future, that will be coming out likely next year with Oxford. And I mentioned that this broadband subscription data, we only have it for every census tract since 2017 from the American Community Survey, but Carolyn and I had a National Science Foundation grant to estimate, to do multi-level modeling using the current population survey from 2000 to fill in the gaps and to estimate broadband subscriptions. We were able to do this for larger counties and for the 50 largest metros. So this gave us this long time series, this unique time series of data. And that's important because having data over time allows us to look at what came first and to address issues of causation. And we see that more broadband subscriptions in a community, this more inclusive use, matters for a number of measures of prosperity, for median income, employment, recovery from the past recession. I won't go into that here, but we see stronger results for this data on broadband subscriptions than for availability. And this is consistent with some work that other colleagues have done using the less precise categorical, the quintile data on adoption from the Federal Communications Commission, or just the 1 year of cross-sectional data from the ACS, but we have this over time. So having said this, broadband subscriptions really are only a very general measure of use in communities. And they don't tell us a lot about how technology is really being used. There is no public data on activities online at the community level. But we can see, especially lately, tracking mobility in the pandemic and Google searches on topics, we can see that there are all kinds of new forms of data, this big data, some of it coming from the internet, but other data from private companies, from credit card companies and so forth, that's being utilized to try to fill in gaps in publicly available data. And so this is what we have done in our research with GoDaddy. We have used data on their domain name websites. These are actually the underlying address book of the internet. If you get a website, you have to register the domain name. And GoDaddy is the world's largest registrar for these domain names. Beyond broadband subscriptions, we see this measure of more specialized use of technology. The data that we have gotten from them is de-identified, and they geocode it by zip code. And the Iowa team has aggregated this upward for counties, for metros, for micropolitan areas. The data that we have is only on sites that are actively being used. Sometimes people can purchase a domain name and just park it and resell it for a profit later if it has a cool name. That's not in this data. It's only sites that are actively being used and that have some services attached. So for us, this is a measure of community level activity online. We are measuring the density of domain name websites. That is the number of these sites per 100 people in the local population, and looking at how this matters for different community outcomes, for economic outcomes. And I'll talk about why economic outcomes in a minute. I'm going to focus here on the 2018 data for counties. We have all kinds of data, but this is this white paper that's being updated. We also have some initial results for monthly data on the domain name websites and monthly data on employment starting in January 2019 and going through May of this year for this analysis. We're still continuing to get that. And if you'd like to take a look later, GoDaddy has a website. They're calling this Project Venture Forward, where they've made some of this available with interactive maps. And there's an older white paper there. You might want to take a look at the website later. So the way that GoDaddy talks about these domain name websites, they call them ventures. It's the term they use for them. And a venture can be a business, a cause, an idea. Obviously, people have websites for a variety of uses. These ventures are discrete websites, and they have services attached. Could be social media, email payments. They vary across the different websites. You can see in the map the distribution of the density of ventures across counties in the US in 2018, in the time period where we're doing this first analysis. And the places that are in darker blue have a higher density of ventures per 100. You see this along the coasts, but not just along the coast in the interior, especially in the West. There's actually quite a lot in lower Michigan here. There are many areas in the interior. This is more diverse than the idea of tech hubs. There are some areas in the midsection where density of ventures is lower, but they're distributed throughout the United States in a variety of communities. And including some of our analysis shows that many of these are in rural areas too. So we have 20 million ventures. That's the data that we're working with in this analysis. Later, we're going to be looking at these globally. In the US, the 20 million represents 19 million different customers. So what do we know about these ventures? We know that about 3/4 of them are actually commercial. From two random sample surveys that GoDaddy did, that we assisted them with the surveys. Each survey had over 2,000 respondents. There was machine learning that their data scientists did, and that's consistent with the results of the surveys. We found during the two surveys, the first in 2019, we found that only about 19% of the ventures conducted business online only. That actually grew for reasons you might guess. During the pandemic, when that was done again in July 2020, that had risen to 35% that were online only. But this also represents some brick and mortar businesses too. We know that in 2020, about 60% of ventures derived some income main or supplemental from the venture. For about a little less than half, this was their main employment. A side gig for a little less than a third of the ventures. Over half, 55%, were solo entrepreneurs, and only 8% had 11 or more employees. So there are a lot of micro businesses here. About 22% started the venture either when they were working only part-time, or they were out of the workforce, unemployed, stay-at-home parents, retirees, etc. So these ventures, while they have businesses that are large and small, this data is unique because it helps us to capture these micro businesses and startups that are too small or too new. They don't get, I'll show you in a minute, they really don't get measured in government small business data. And by counting numbers, this density, rather than looking at them by income, this really emphasizes the role of these small businesses, including these micro entrepreneurs. So there are different levels of activity for the ventures. The data scientists at GoDaddy categorized these for us by demand, how busy the venture was, by links to the internet, how connected it was, the services associated with the venture, the breadth, in other words. And so using cluster analysis, they came up with these 4 clusters. For the analysis I'm going to show you, we're actually combining them into 2. So clusters 3 and 4, we call the highly active ventures, and that represents about a third of the websites, and clusters 1 and 2 with low or moderate levels of activity, that represents about 2/3 of these websites. So we asked, does this data really represent something new? Is it just small businesses, or is this just reflecting broadband subscriptions? Well, you know, we correlated this with data on broadband subscriptions, and there's a moderate correlation. That makes sense. You need broadband in order to do this. There's some overlap with broadband. It's dependent on broadband subscriptions, some overlap with small businesses, but again, that's just a moderate correlation. And so we're looking at some things that are distinct from just the small businesses usually counted by the census. And for IT employment, the correlation is even lower. This isn't just tracking tech hubs where there's a high share of IT employment. So one of the dependent variables that's important here that I'll be showing is actually a prosperity index. We have adapted this from something called the Distressed Communities Index. It was created by a think tank called the Economic Innovation Group. And their analysis is at zip code level, county level. So there's an advantage in that they cover a number of geographies, but they talk about communities on a continuum from distress to prosperity. Since we're looking at what the benefits are from these ventures, we have flipped this index. It's the Distressed Community Index, 1 minus the score for the Distressed Community Index, to emphasize prosperity. So higher scores on the index means higher levels of prosperity in our case. And we've updated this with 2018 census data, since theirs only went through 2016 and we're looking at 2018 data. We include the same as they do, the percent of the adult population without a high school diploma, vacancy rates, workforce participation, poverty rates, median household income is a ratio of the state's household income, percentage of change in jobs, and also businesses. The thing that's important about this index for us is that it includes outcomes for residents as well as outcomes for businesses. And some of the data on broadband availability infrastructure has been mixed. For example, COCO showed that broadband infrastructure benefited businesses, but not necessarily residents in the area. So looking at the 2018 data that we use, how this is distributed across counties in the US, again, higher prosperity scores with darker blue. Actually, there are areas in the plains in the midsection of the country where prosperity scores are high. It's noticeable, though, that they tend to be lower in the South, some areas of the Southwest, and some areas of the Midwest, where those areas are shaded lighter. So we look at outcomes, several different types of outcomes. This prosperity index for economic prosperity, we look at median income, at a measure that I'll talk about, a measure of change called recovery from the last recession, and employment. Actually, we're looking at unemployment data. And we hypothesize that the higher density of ventures in counties, again, we're looking at the county level in this analysis, is significant and positively related to these outcomes in all these cases. So using this prosperity index that I talked about in 2018, looking across counties, we use multivariate regression. We're controlling for a number of variables for demographics, race, ethnicity, age cohorts in the population, educational attainment, percentage employed, and also controlling for the industry mix in the county using the NAICS codes, the North American Industry Classification System codes. And the results you can see in the models on the right, we have a model where we're just looking at all ventures, venture density, and another model where we look only at these highly active ventures, this cluster 3 and 4. And we can see in both cases that ventures are significant. And in fact, highly active ventures matter, the density of highly active ventures, as you might expect, matters more. The benefits are greater. Broadband subscriptions also is positive and significant. I'm not showing all these variables. It's huge, long list. But small business density is significant and actually negative in both of these models. And that's true in some other models I'll show too. So looking at predicted probabilities, how do we interpret this? Is highly active ventures, and that's on the right. Again, both all ventures and highly active ventures matter here, but looking on the right, you can see a steeper slope for highly active ventures. And as they rise in a county from 0 to 2 per 100 people, the average prosperity score on this index rises from 47 to nearly 54. So that's almost a 7 percentage point increase. What does that mean? How do you interpret that? Well, we know that 50% of counties have prosperity scores between 32 and 56 on this index. So this is a pretty large impact from just 2 domain name websites per 100 people. We also look at measures of change. What I just showed is in a single year, that's cross-sectional. It's important to look at change because this can strengthen causal claims, showing whether it's just more prosperous areas that already had more ventures that are doing better. the Economic Innovation Group has a measure of change from 2007 that they call recovery from the previous recession. We've extended this through 2018. Theirs just went through 2016, change in 2 time periods here. And so the controls are all the same as in the previous analysis. And we can see in this case, broadband subscriptions are not significant, but venture density and highly active venture density both predict increased change, more positive change since the last recession. And we can see here that, again, you know, the effects are greater, the slope is greater for, on the right, for highly active ventures. We can also see, so that's 0 at the top of those charts. We can see that many communities are still worse off by 2018 in comparison with 2007, but that venture density predicts more progress toward recovery. And around 2.5 ventures on the right, around 2.5 highly active ventures per 100 in those communities, they were more likely to have recovered, gotten back up to 0 since the past recession. And we can see the regional patterns here in red and in orange, where there's been less recovery since the past recession. And we see in the Northeast and in areas of the midsection, some of the North Plains, Northwest, that there's been less recovery, that there are some regional patterns to this as well. So we also look at the effect of ventures on changes in income. Here we're just looking over a 2-year period, but again, this is a measure of change, which helps us to establish whether it was just places that had higher incomes in the first place where we're seeing the effects. And controlling for other factors, each highly active venture is associated with $408 increase in median household income. This compares to an average increase for about $3,600 for this period. So it's an 11 percentage point boost in median income for those places that have more highly active, for each highly active venture per 100. Again, this is using the same control variables. The models are similar as before. And in this case, only highly active ventures are significant, not ventures overall. But we can see that for highly active ventures, there is this positive effect. So finally, how do ventures matter for resilience during COVID-19? Small businesses, we know, have been disproportionately affected during this period, and we wonder whether communities with a high density of ventures are able to weather the storm better, or can they recover more afterward? So businesses with lots of online transactions, you saw that trend, may be able to continue more during the pandemic. As businesses reopen, they may be using their websites to market themselves online that they're open again, or even in the aftermath, micro businesses might be able to start up with little capital that, you know, especially if they don't have to rent physical space, they may be able to get started and try out their business or their idea just online. We saw that places with more ventures recovered better in the last recession, so we wonder what effect this has now. So we have monthly data on venture density and also the unemployment, the monthly BLS unemployment figures since January 2019. And for this analysis, we're continuing to getting this data, but this analysis just goes through May 2020. We've used a series of regressions with time-fixed effects by months. Ventures in the previous month are used to predict unemployment rates in the following month. And again, using the same covariates, the same controls variables as in the earlier models. We can see here in the first model on the left that ventures are not significant. Actually, broadband subscription rates are positive. They predict more unemployment. Remember, we're looking at unemployment here. But interestingly enough, if we have introduced an interaction term with venture density times broadband adoption, the broadband subscription rate, we can see that this interaction term is significant and negative. In other words, it predicts lower rates of unemployment, which is what you want to see, this negative impact. If we just look at ventures alone, they're positive. There's actually higher unemployment just looking at ventures alone. But in that model on the right with the interaction terms, we do see some effects from the combination of venture density and broadband subscriptions. So, how do we interpret this? As that second model showed, when subscription rates are low, ventures are actually associated with an increase in the unemployment rate. But however, as broadband subscriptions increase, ventures start to have a positive effect on unemployment. So the community has to have both high broadband adoption, subscription rates, and a high density of ventures to see a positive effect. And when broadband subscriptions are below 60%, ventures increase unemployment, whereas when they're higher than that, ventures reduce unemployment. So, this is an interesting finding. We think that this says that a venture really, requires that there be an online market locally, that people in the area are active online. That creates a market, that creates, this interaction with the digital economic activity, commercial activity online. And that's what produces these benefits, the combination. So just to sum up these results for counties, again, controlling for broadband subscriptions and small business and demographics and industries, we can see ventures predict higher scores on the prosperity index. Highly active ventures have an even stronger effect. They predict change since the last recession. Highly active ventures at least predict change in median income. There's partial support for that hypothesis. And there's also some partial support for the effect on unemployment, both before and during the pandemic. Again, ventures alone aren't significant, but this combination with broadband is. Broadband adoption, broadband subscriptions also matter in many of these models, but online economic activity matters more when we're looking at economic outcomes. So just to conclude, this is a new measure of online participation in communities for us. That's been the benefit for us, this project. Something beyond just broadband connectivity or IT employment, beyond this traditional business data from the census. We can see that these ventures are significant predictors for prosperity, median income, and employment, controlling for other factors. And this suggests that digital inclusion, again, broadband subscriptions matter too, and digital entrepreneurship are both policies for more inclusive local economic development. Government data really doesn't capture this evolution of the economy online, these micro businesses and fledgling startups, and also the added value of having a digital presence for other businesses, for brick and mortar businesses. This suggests that it would be useful to look at other activities online for health and education, news, government services, and more, so we can expand what we know, the evidence about broadband's impact. I hope in the future that people will find different kinds of data, that researchers will find opportunities to use new forms of data, both, capturing evidence online, but also using private sector data to fill some of these gaps that we have in data and evidence. And just to mention, there's so much data that we still have to analyze that we can do. And one area is to really look further at impacts on the pandemic and hopefully recovery afterward. We feel with this data, we're able to really trace digital activity at the grassroots, and this will help us to understand more about resilience and recovery. We have a lot of data from the 2020 survey, including questions about whether or how ventures helped during the pandemic, survey data on needs for venture growth and factors associated with venture density. And this can suggest some things for local economic development, some needs. We can look at changes in density of ventures and levels of activity during and after the shutdown. We'll be looking at that, how this affects recovery and resilience. We have data on metropolitan areas, micropolitan areas, and which are less populated, more rural too. We can look at the effects in communities with different economic or industry profiles, and we're going to be doing a project where we look at how ventures matter in communities of color, a zip code level analysis, and also in low-income zip codes. So there's so much that we're going to be doing in the future, and we're excited to have access to this data and to be able to take a look at these activities online. Thanks.